competition keeps prices down far more effectively.
As long as suffering of sentient beings remain, I will remain in order to serve.
I imagined God like my grandfather.
In Conversations today, my guest has been the driving force behind India's space program, both as a scientist and as an administrator. He is today a member of the Department of Space, the Space Commission, and a member of the United Nations Commission for the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. I'm delighted to welcome Professor U.R. Rao.
Thank you.
Professor Rao, there's, at the moment, with the post-nuclear bomb scenario, there's a great deal of debate, anguish, and concern amongst liberal opinion about the peaceful uses of India's space program. And you are on this very important United Nations Commission that will look at these issues. To what degree do you feel that India has committed itself and its space program has manifest for peaceful purposes?
Well, as far as our space program is concerned, it has been totally used for peaceful purposes. From the very inception, we had the goal. In fact, we started with the goal of eradication of illiteracy, and that's how the SITE program was started. Then we said we'll have to do it on a totally self-reliant basis, so we must build satellites. And then we used satellites also for the management of natural resources, meteorological forecasting, and flood forecasting, and drought forecasting, and so on. Now, therefore, the rockets which we built is for self-reliance, and they are all designed to carry the satellites of the type which we want to launch. Like, for example, the Polar Launch Vehicle, that the PSLV, is supposed to launch the remote sensing satellites, which are of the order of something like 1.2 tons in weight, and they are put into the polar orbit from pole to pole. The GSLV, the Geostationary Launch Vehicle, can launch something like 2.5 tons of weight into geostationary transfer orbit. That is the INSAT class of satellites. Therefore, entire program is built around our requirements for the country. Now, when you come to the use of, in the peaceful use of outer space, of which I am the chairman of the United Nations Committee, which not only deals with the technical aspects, but also the international cooperation and also all the treaties. We have, in fact, the treaty on the nuclear power sources, which prohibits the use of the nuclear power sources in rockets unless they are deep space probes, where you have no choice. Unless they go very far away from the sun, you have no choice. But then they are activated after they leave the Earth's orbit so that they don't come down.
I was referring to the argument that the primary imperative for India's ability and the development of rockets and launch vehicles was really military, and the rest were perhaps just valuable offshoots.
But it did not start so. You see, primary motivation for the rocket development was space in our case. Well, if something has been used from this into military, it is actually the other way around. In fact, Mr. Kalam himself was the project director for the first SLV-3, which was a small launch vehicle compared to what we are talking about now. SLV launch vehicle was the one which could put up something like 40 kilograms into low Earth orbit. Today we are talking of 2.5 tons into geostationary transfer orbits. Therefore, our program started primarily for peaceful purposes, and in fact the entire technology development within the Department of Space has been aimed at really utilizing space for the benefit of the people in the country.
Tell me, you were an administrator, a scientist who also took on the mantle of being an administrator and working with the system and processes of government. in an area that demanded enormous precision and discipline. Something we have come in India not to ordinarily associate with government initiatives and government projects. What was the secret of your success? How did we pull this off?
I think there is fundamentally one of the major things I think which has happened is the fact that the Atomic Energy Commission was formed by Homi Bhabha, and Homi Bhabha had a great amount of influence. It's a one-page constitution of the atomic energy which was written down by himself personally. It starts with the first sentence that the Atomic Energy Commission has been formed by the Government of India with its own special provisions to get away from the needlessly, look at the words, needlessly inelastic rules of the government. And the commission, for example, doesn't need a quorum, chairman can overrule everybody, and he reports only to the Prime Minister. And if he overrules the finance secretary, then he has to inform the Prime Minister. Now we borrowed the same thing. Therefore, a certain amount of extra powers were invested into these departments. Secondly, I think it had right people, whether it was Homi Bhabha or Dr. Vikram Sarabhai, and later followed by Satish Dhawan, and myself, who had specific, in fact, we had specific goals, extremely well-defined goals and well-defined path. And we all knew that the question of embargoes, which we are talking of today, is not new. As you know, when we had a cryogenic business, we had a most terrible embargo, and that embargo has continued, even though nobody talks about it. Therefore, we had built up self-reliance from the very beginning, so that we will not suffer because of the lack of availability. Because when you are talking of TV production, or when you talk of the TV the dissemination or the communications, you cannot afford to have break-in service. And you have committed to provide service on 24-hour basis, 365 days a year, and to the growing demands of the people.
But surely it was something more than your ability to function autonomously, that you were able to counter the culture almost of, shall we say, imprecision and chaos that we normally associate with public initiative in India.
Well, on the one hand, I must tell you that of course chaos is the normal thing. The order is a special thing of the chaos. But notwithstanding, I think both Atomic and in Space did well in refusing to come to Delhi and put their headquarters. I think that's one of the major things, so that we don't have to spend too much time in attending the meetings and so on. And Atomic Energy went to Bombay, and Space stayed in Bangalore. And it also helps to make sure that since all the technical departments, or the major departments are there, like the rocket launching or rocket design in Trivandrum, satellite design and tracking in Bangalore, Sriharikota, our launching pad, and Hyderabad, the National Remote Sensing Agency, except for Ahmedabad, which is on the west. Therefore, it was easy for the chairman, the ISRO, to concentrate on the technical issues and spend more time on really getting the things moving. And the second thing is, when you have a well-defined goal, and this is what I have found, and you really pick up the young people, you are able to really motivate them. In fact, I can still remember the days, which is in fact we call it the golden days, when we started the satellite program. We signed the first agreement for the first satellite, Aryabhat in 1972, April. I had no place. 1972, August. And in fact, that was the time when I changed from professorship of the Physical Asset Laboratory to space. And Mrs. Gandhi said, look, on your word we have signed, you better change. And I said, I went and took simply sheds, industrial sheds in Pina. In fact, they didn't have even the walls at that time. I said, give me the roof, I'll construct the walls. We constructed the most modern buildings. And we didn't have a single person. I just went round the universities and the technical institutions. In 2 months, I collected something like 200 people. And I said, look, we are going to build a satellite in 2.5 years. And that's how we built the first satellite. And then, of course, is the history. Now, the question is that people were terribly motivated because this is something which is so challenging. And it was very difficult to get them to go back home. And it used to be really fantastic. We didn't have roads, the roofs were leaking, but we still created a fantastically beautiful, clean room, a small clean room where we could integrate the first satellite array. But the buildings came later, the good buildings.
But tell me, are you despairing that the brain drain in India might deprive our space programs of that vital talent that you were able to draw at that time?
I don't think the brain drain is going to worry me, honestly. But what worries me is that if we don't keep up these goals, if we don't keep up the focus, and if we don't keep the motivation, then we are going to lose the people.
Do I sense a concern that we may not keep up our motivation, that we may not keep up our goals?
Well, I don't have the concern, but on the other hand, one has to continuously keep up this. You see, there must be challenge. When you talk of scientists, they look at challenges. And you ask them to repeat the same thing. Therefore, after I took over as the chairman of the Space Commission and the Secretary of the Department of Space, one of the things we did was what can be done in industry should be transferred to industry. In fact, this is what is done in the United States, this is what is done in Europe. For example, NASA doesn't build satellites and rockets. Sure. It's built in industries, in McDonnell Douglas, in Martin Marietta, and in Boeing and so on, or in L'Oreal, or the Hughes and so on. So we have tried that. For example, today we developed the technology for propellants. The solid propellants are built by Mafatlaal Industries. We passed it on. And the liquid propellants are built by Andhra Sugars. They are produced. Because it's extremely difficult to ask a scientist to go on producing thousands of tons a day.
Right.
He would like to tinker around and find a better one. Therefore, you need to give him a goal which is far beyond. Now, when you talk of the next 20 years, where is the space going to go? And
what is your goal? What is your dream for India?
Well, my dream for India is that I think that firstly we will have to use the satellites, one for the eradication of illiteracy, particularly distance education on a large scale. We have now a large experiment going on in Jhabua district. We have a large number of receivers spread in the tribal areas, and we started with a site program. We ran that pit station and educational programs. The question is how to really bring in meaningful education, not the normal classical education, to the rural areas so that the people can improve their own conditions and quality of life. How to make them understand the better agricultural practices are required, including, for example, when to put pesticides, when you should not put pesticides, when do you stop putting the fertilizers. What is the point in putting fertilizers? For example, if the moment immediately you put the rice replantation, because the replantation shock is there. Therefore, you have to really inform these to the people and build them up and tell them where they can get things. Now, the communication is something which is extremely bad. The drinking water, for example, is something again space can help. Even urban planning. Now, it is true that there is a large amount of political play involved. Obviously, some of the urban planning things which we say, look, you put the road this way, this is the right way to go. But then you will find that there are other interests, vested interests, which will take over and will not allow this. But by and large, we hope that we can start really providing these inputs.
These are sort of many of the exciting applications of technology and of imaging and communication. But in terms of technology, do you see, I don't know what, an Indian on the moon or an Indian in space that we launch ourselves? What kind
we had, of course, Rakesh Sharma going up, and after that we did have plans for a couple of more going as payload scientists, but for the Challenger failure it would have happened. But from the very beginning, if you go back to what Dr. Sarabhai said, our aim is not to put a man on the moon, but use space for the benefit of the people in the nation. We have technical challenges. The question is that if you look at the technology growth, everything is getting miniaturized. We talked of large satellites, today we are talking of small satellites. We talked of only geostationary satellites. Now when you come to Iridium and teledesic and so on, we are talking of a large number of low Earth orbiting satellites and smaller satellites. So bringing down the cost, this is an extremely important thing.
Just wondered if there was something like, when Kennedy said that the Americans should put a man on the moon before the end of the 60s, or our goal was to put our own communication satellite. Is there something that sort of the lay person like me can identify and understand as our aspiration or our goal for satellite technology in India?
I I'm afraid right now we don't have, except that look, we must surely build the capability to, because the GSLV has yet to be launched. First launch will take place sometime next year. It has to be proven, but our goals haven't changed yet. But eventually they are going to go into smaller satellites. And when we are talking of smaller satellites, we are already come to a point where we are called as microsatellites and nanosatellites. And in fact, some of the microsatellites are being built already. And we have already entered a commercial system also. For example, we are going to launch a satellite for Germany. We are going to launch a satellite for Korea with our own launch vehicles from Sriharikota. We already launched a few payloads. And we have sold quite a number of systems to Hughes, which is the largest.
What percentage of these launches and the technology and the materials that it uses, what percentage of them are imported and how much of it is indigenous?
Practically, well, except for the very high quality electronic components, like the large scale integrated circuits. Unfortunately, electronics is a weak point in this country. Everything is built here. And if at all we buy in small components. And the entire systems design, everything is done here. Now, when I say that we buy the components, it's not always because of the technology problem. It's because of the fact that the quantity involved is not sufficient.
For economies
and
of scale
therefore
and
economy of scale doesn't come into picture, and therefore you say, look, all right, you buy this, because there are hardly 3 or 4 vendors of this type of things.
As a scientist, how do you respond to the recent US sanctions against scientists and not giving visas and asking people to leave, and this whole vocabulary that has been introduced?
I believe it is unfortunate. You see, particularly when people are, there are 2 types of things which have happened. One is the people like Chidambaram who are going for a conference. Now, most of these conferences are under what is known as the ICSU, that is the International Council of Scientific Unions. And in fact, you are supposed to give in writing that no such restrictions will be placed on anybody. It's supposed to be free for everybody. I mean, of course, you have to pay for the registration fee and so on. And the second is the people who are working. Of course, they are within their sovereign rights to say, look, all right, those who are working in sensitive areas, they will, through interaction, they will get some technology. But if you look at the Indian scientists, none of them are really working on the most sensitive areas. But obviously, when you are working in a field, you will have interaction, and probably that's the one they worry, that through these interactions, particularly bright people will be able to pick up ideas. My own feeling is that, and I hope it's only a temporary, but I think it is a perennial. You cannot stop the spread of science and technology. It may take a little bit more effort. And for example, the cryogenic. Now, under pressure from the United States, Russia had to sort of go back on its contract. We renegotiated just simply because the fact that having given the money, we had to get back our thing. Therefore, instead of 2 engines, we said we'll take 5 engines. I forget about the technology transfer. But we had already started building, and I have no doubt we'll build it. And in fact, it's been already tested. Therefore, the question is not one of the technology problem. It'll take a bit more time probably, but we'll have to go through failures. On the other hand, if you get the technology transfer quickly, then you avoid those failures. But then I think we have to learn as a mature nation, sometimes the failures are the stepping stone to success.
You know, as a scientist who was an administrator and had to work closely inevitably work closely with the political establishment, what has been the relationship between science and politics?
Well, as far as space was concerned, I must say that it has been extremely cordial. I worked under 6 prime ministers, and of different color, creed, and philosophy. I mean, I started with the Morarji Desai, then we had Mrs. Gandhi, and I had Rajiv Gandhi, I had VP Singh, I had Chandrasekhar, and then Narasimha Rao, and so on. But everybody, I must say, some understood more than others, that's a different matter, but everybody supported the space program.
Did you ever feel that you wanted to push an agenda that might have been different to what the political leadership or even the bureaucracy wanted?
Fortunately, in space, no. In fact, we pushed the agenda what we wanted. In fact, I still remember the 10-year profiles which Mrs. Gandhi was worried. She said, look, why do you want 10-year profiles? Why don't you go along the 5-year profiles? And we had to say, and this was during Prof. Dhawan's time, that look, we don't believe in 5-year profiles. The gestation period for some of these things is of the order of 5 years. Therefore, we must have a 10-year profile, a long-term profile, and it must gel with the whole thing. And then after hearing the whole thing, she said, look, I can't commit money. I said, who wants you to commit money? I said, we want you to approve the 10-year profile in the Parliament so that we don't take wrong decisions in between and stop this, stop that, and so on. We go with one single-minded goal. And money, as the money is available, we are with 10 may be squeezed to 8, and if the money is not available, 10 may go to 12. But we want the program as a whole to be accepted, and it has to be a national program.
Have you been sometimes sort of despairing or frustrated that you have developed technology, you have developed through technology and science an opportunity? You know, for example, the communications revolution and this whole aspect of using communications to educate, and you have very eloquently talked about how that can be used to alleviate poverty and inform farmers about when you should put pesticides and how you should do this, that in fact the software to actually make real what you have created an infrastructure for hasn't been forthcoming in most cases.
You're very right. This is one of my grouses, and unfortunately we started with education as our main thing, and that's the one which is lagged behind. I would have liked distance education to be absolutely available all over the country today. People, we have been shouting, look, software is not an easy thing. It takes a long time to build software, and it has to be the right type of software. And in fact, the site, we showed that how we can build, getting the best people with at least money. We built a few studios for these people. But somehow, you see, the revenue earning business gets into picture, and even today, even in the total revenue which is earned is only hardly 600, 700 crores by Doordarshan and the All India Radio together, whereas their expenses are almost 2,600 crores. Now, we have a problem, since I'm also a Prasad Bharati board member. On the one hand, we say it should be an autonomous body. An autonomous body can remain autonomous only if it does not extend its hand for money. That means they must generate revenue. And at the same time, the moment you extend the hand for money and you ask money from the government, obviously there is going to be interference. There are the ministers are going to say, look, show our face all the time, and so on. And the views, you have to follow whatever the government says. We want it to be totally independent. And therefore, you have to essentially make sure that there is a balance between the two, cross-subsidize. Now, this I hope will happen. But our problem is that the prime time available is a time when everybody would like to advertise. That's the time when you can get money. But then you have any number of news in so many languages, the parliamentary news, this and that, and so on. With the result, you really have very little of time available. The rest of the time, you don't get money, you don't get advertisers, because after all, the advertisers give you money only when they can reach the largest number of people. But we will have to balance these two, and we certainly will have to provide a far more for the education. I would like to see, in fact, a GramSat was a concept which was just purely meant for educational purposes. And return of it, unfortunately, is not direct in the sense that you don't collect the revenue. In telecommunications, this is different because you charge, and therefore there is no problem. But more important is the education. And if we can educate, I think we have solved half the problem of the country. And this is where we certainly have lagged behind. China has done much better, but then of course their whole system is totally different.
Professor Rao, thank you very much indeed. That's been a great privilege.
Thank you. And slowly, the personalized communication is coming into picture. In fact, the global mobile personal communication system